Okay, let's get started again. A number of people at the break were wondering whether there was still need for a panel after the last Q&A session. And I'm kind of anticipating that this is going to run itself. But I will make a couple, throw out a couple of framing remarks and, comments that the panelists should feel free to comment on if they feel like it or not. So we've heard a lot of talks in this session identifying tensions and problems regarding social norms and machine learning, including privacy and fairness and discrimination. And we've heard just a couple of talks actually trying to propose technical solutions, including from Cynthia and Richard. And kind of going back to my comments in the Q&A just before the break, where I was trying to explain that there's a piece of the machine learning process which is actually very well understood and relatively simple and transparent, which is, you have some loss function, usually an error of some notion that you're trying to minimize. And one way of kind of thinking about the talks that are starting to propose solutions can be thought of as trying to endogenizing some social norm in the objective function, like adding a penalty term to your objective function for unfairness. So this is something you can do, and I kind of think of this as an early attempt to encode social norms inside of the machine learning process. So I can actually have not just a term in my objective function which asks that I minimize the classification error, but I can have an additional penalty that says I should try to minimize the difference between the difference between false negative rates between two populations, for instance. Okay, and I could have a weight on that term and sort of play around with the strength of that weight, and to not get too technical about it, kind of trace out a Pareto curve, if you like, of models that specify the available trade-offs between accuracy and whatever notion of fairness you're interested in. So, I just want to comment that, this is the kind of thing that machine learning people do. This is a very natural thing for us, to kind of take some property we'd like our model to have and encode it in the learning process. And so I and others are starting to think this way. I think it's still very early days, and we haven't yet explored what the possibilities and limitations are. But I'm kind of interested in people's thoughts on, first of all, how far can this be taken? How far should we take it? Will people in this room even be remotely satisfied by whatever social norm you're concerned about, being part of the optimization process in what might still seem like a fairly opaque, opaque algorithm? So I want to toss that out there. And, I think this is related to something that was implicit in the discussion and debate before the break, which is, how do we address this gap between the extreme specificity of algorithms, and machine learning algorithms in particular, and what seems to be the extreme and in many cases deliberately vague aspects of law and policy, right? So what's the API going to look like, to use a computer science term? How are we ever going to bridge that gap? And part of the answer, of course, is meetings like this. But at the end of the day, algorithms do very specific things, right? And that I think is never, that just fundamentally can't change. That's what algorithms do. And so I was kind of found myself wondering in the discussion, and this is the wrong way of putting it, but is the problem that algorithms are too specific, or is the problem that the law is too vague? And where will we meet in the middle, and how? And let me throw that out there and let panelists comment, and we can also have interaction with the audience.
I wasn't going to answer that question, but I can answer a different one. So I wanted to comment on something from the earlier discussion, which was about transparency. So I agree with you that the neural network algorithm is transparent. I can teach it to a class in less than half an hour of, first-year master's students or whatever, but that's different than the model being transparent. Right? The model being transparent, the model is the set of calculations someone does to produce a risk score, say. That's what I was trying to make transparent, right? So those two things are very, very different. Okay? And also, so one thing that also goes along with that is that, if you're using a non-transparent model to make predictions, it can encode information that you don't want it to. And a kind of a key example of that is what Target was doing a couple of years ago, where there was this article saying that they were able to detect that someone was pregnant before they knew they were pregnant. And I don't know if that article was true, but the fact that perhaps there was some inner layer of a neural network that's encoding pregnancy, that's a bit of private information that you're not sure you want that neural network to have, and that could easily come up as font size in resumes, or it could come up as race in a recidivism prediction model, and you'd never know if it was using that hidden information that was encoded somehow in the neural network if you didn't understand the model.
Let me go to Peter, who is next, and then to Pam.
Great. So, we're talking a lot about transparency, but it occurs to me that transparency really isn't the end. Transparency is a means to an end. And in the AI 100 report that I talked about before, we talked about what are the possible benefits of machine learning within the next 15 years, and what are the barriers to achieving them. The barriers are not, transparency itself is not the barrier. It's winning the trust of the users that's the barrier. So I see transparency as a means towards an end as opposed to the goal itself. Trust can be achieved through many different ways. And so transparency is one thing that's being put forth as a way to get trust, for people to trust algorithms. But another way is just through experience, right? We trust human drivers not because they're transparent, but because we have a lot of experience with what they do. And so I think we should be really looking at how do we achieve trust as opposed to how do we achieve transparency.
So a couple of thoughts. So I wrote a report with Robert Gellman. It was published in 2014. It was called The Scoring of America. And we documented hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of scores that are non-public scores. That was a lot of work. And we also documented the source data for those scores, and it's quite extensive. The source data is surprising and a bit inflammatory in some cases. That's the beginning of the story, right? I think that's something that it's hard to put our hands on, but it's really important to contemplate, is when a model has been trained, it is this is the way I think of it, it's a new entity. It has certain qualities we may not be able to immediately crack open and just identify with extraordinary 100% technicolor precision. There is a little bit of mystery there. Can we manage that gray area? And instead of insisting on focusing on that particular gray area, are there other things that we can do to acquire what we need in terms of social justice and fairness and non-discrimination? I believe there are things that we can do. I believe we can look at the inputs, whether they be algorithms or other things. I believe transparency, I agree with your comments. I think transparency is about trust. There are also certain transparency mechanisms that are helpful. And it's about use. How are we using these? And what are the rules? But my most practical thing that I can say that kind of cuts through any theory is this. Why not come up with focused, very focused use cases and work through these problems in a fact-based manner? I think that's what's necessary. We can talk for a long time, but why don't we work through these things and come up with generalizable particulars in various very focused use cases?
Yeah, just a quick point. If we were talking about personalized medicine, would these same problems be troubling people? What about the automatic pilot on the jets that brought a lot of you here? Do you want to really know all the details of that engineering? Or are you satisfied that you're here alive? So I think we're playing with different standards for different uses. I think this was a point that was just made. And it seems to me to be reasonable, we want to think about applying the same standards, or maybe not. We have some articulated way to decide. Why should a risk assessment instrument be treated differently from a personalized medicine algorithm? And maybe there's a good reason for that. What I typically hear is these questions of justice, but then I come back to the point that was raised yesterday. What about the victims? Okay, they count too, and they're not part of the algorithm. So there's a lot of confusion because we conflate how these algorithms are going to be used with the nature of the algorithms themselves. And until we sort that out, we're going to be using different rules to assess different kinds of applications. And it leads to a very confusing discussion.
So I completely agree with that, what Richard just said. But I think at least at the moment, there have to be different use cases. There have to be different algorithms for different use cases. And there have to be different features used for different use cases. So for instance, maybe this is not a good example, but at least I'm going to give it. So the use of race, for instance. Let's say that I wanted to, let's say I was social services and I wanted to best use my social services to reduce recidivism. Well, maybe I want to use race in there. That's different than predicting recidivism for some other like legal use. So it's what features you use in any case has to be regulated.
But then the question is, who decides?
Okay, this is I love this interchange. So I finished a study.
Just hang 1 second.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
So I see people in the audience. I wanted to just let the panelists speak a little bit first, and then we'll open it up for questions and discussions. Hopefully, please use the microphones, but go ahead, Pam.
Thank you. I apologize for interrupting you. So just very quickly on your point, I just finished a study actually in like November. I didn't want to release it because the news cycle was hideous. But it had to do with exactly this issue. There's a national data set of all wallet spends from a particular financial credit card company. And I analyzed the data and layered it on top of HUD data and data regarding individuals living below the poverty line, and also I correlated it with race. And the results were really, really intriguing. And I absolutely wanted to use race as a factor. Why? Because I was trying to understand things. There was a really wonderful EPA study where they looked at pollution by zip code, and they didn't look at race, but of course there were race correlates, but they wanted to find out how to direct services and benefits. So I agree. I think that there are times we want to use a prohibited factor. And the thing is that prohibited factors, race is a prohibited factor in credit. But it's not prohibited across the board. So what are, again, I apologize if I'm annoying people, but what are the generalizable principles we can arrive at when we look at factual use cases? I believe we'll get there at some point. We're not there yet, but we can get there. And I think it's a really important path.
Sorry. Yeah. No, and then I'll pass the mic to you, or if you have a mic, or maybe you want to come here. On the API, between legislators and model builders, I was thinking about, how in electronics chips became so complicated through history that the only way you could understand how they work was through very extensive test sets, right? And so I wonder whether, working together, whether from the legislation side, we could get, prototypes of cases where you're like, hey, if you have these two inputs, right, these two individuals, maybe, race, gender, and other things are different, but all other variables are equal enough that you would expect that the credit score should be the same, or like, other predictions should be the same, right? I think that would be, I'm a sort of model builder, right? So from my perspective, that'd be a very, very useful tool to have, because then if I want to use, as a mechanism, maybe regularization, like you were saying, or maybe something else, right? At least I know how to build, an objective function that I can sort of apply as a constraint to my problem, right? And I can say, fine, I'm going to try to be as accurate as possible, but, with the constraint that my predictions can't deviate too much on these sort of set of pairs, right? And building them will be difficult, but I think it gives like a very concrete problem to try and solve.
So you're kind of suggesting that the API might take the form of data.
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
sort of like examples of parties that should be treated equally.
Exactly.
Yeah,
that's right.
Interesting.
Thank you. I'm not sure I will be able to formulate the question, so I'll try. This is about the value of algorithmic insight, especially in a court of law, in regards to accountability and transparency. As an example, we use a predictive model in a hospital system to predict whether or not patients will die or will require mechanical ventilation, respiratory assistance, basically, in the next 48 hours. And that drives a lot of decision makings downstream and the way we treat or do or not do things for the patients. And just to be transparent, we also show what was the score in our electronic medical report system. We show the score that invoked a specific action and the trending of the scores that happened before and after that specific trigger event. And it is known, but we can explain it somehow in a very obscure way for our clinicians, what it means, what it is trying to predict, but that's not the problem. The problem is when you put it in the medical record, it goes into downstream systems, it goes into our regional health information network, other people see it without even knowing what this score is, and it goes to lawsuits and legal cases that patients look at it and now they want to compare it to a very specific measurement that the device did. So I want to pick your brains in terms of what is the really standing of these algorithmic insight that comes out of nowhere. An automated agent constantly monitors and creates these scores for the patients. Very few people can even attempt to describe it in a practical setting, but it is now everywhere. And what will be the implications of that for users like our hospital system that are now trying to build on this?
Are you referring to the frailty score?
No, this is something we've developed.
Okay, so there's the frailty score, which is an extraordinarily a close predictor of death within the year. And then there's also the Affordable Care Act health score, which is also a predictor of illness, which is incredibly accurate. So there are a profusion of risk scores like this. They are unregulated to some degree, although there is a real argument here that, so for example, the medical adherence score, which is produced by FICO, that is an unregulated score because it does not use protected health information as its factors to create it doesn't feed it in. However, the Affordable Care Act score and the frailty score, if it's just using protected health information from the hospital health file, there is every reason to believe that that score itself is considered to be protected health information under HIPAA. So technically speaking, a patient should be able to request that score under one of the rights of HIPAA, which is a federal legal right, and should be able to produce an amendment to, they cannot delete the score under HIPAA, but they can object to it. Now, the lawsuits, I have heard about these lawsuits. I think some of the problem here is actually just simply terminology. The frailty score problems have been when the word frailty has been in the patient record and all of a sudden their health insurance payment or costs go sky high. So I think these are these related to the AI here? Or is that a separate issue? So I think this is the crux, I think, where we have to look. This isn't really an AI problem. The scores are profoundly predictive. This problem is surrounding it. It's not the mystery of how it works. It's that it's there.
But the question was, I understand the notion, but the question was if the insight generated by an algorithm has the same standing as an insight created by a human being. if I am observing, I'm putting my hand on somebody's forehead and say, this person has fever, and I write it down, and then there's this obscure notion that this person has a 95% chance of needing mechanical ventilation in 48 hours, and I do something that will hurt his ribs and take him to a completely different route in terms of their long-term outcome, and I have really no way of saying where exactly this came from.
Okay, now I hear more of your question. Okay, that is actually, I think, a medical ethics question, because there are many such scores, and there are so many competing scores that work so similarly. There really does appear to be evidence that they do appear to be working, and these scores have been in existence for quite some time now. So I think that question is a very challenging question. I don't have an answer. I do think it would have to be a conversation with medical ethicists and people who are practicing medicine. I do.
If I could just say a few words about this, I think that the world of healthcare analytics and the use of these analytics to make life and death resource allocation decisions, this is going to be a big, hot issue for medical ethics, because it goes against the kind of professionalization of the duty of the professional doctor to the individual. So the clinician is enculturated in the principle of acting in the best interests of the individual patient only. And your entire commitment is to making that person better. And increasingly we have these systems that say, okay, you need to make that person better, but you have to think of all these other people who are queuing up the healthcare. We only have a limited pot of resources, and on that basis we think that this other person should be prioritized. And here's the data which suggests that this is what you should do. Now there we are in an ethical quandary about what is the right thing to do. So in a sense, what you have is a kind of extreme form of protocolization. So we have had problems of protocols, and to what extent can the clinician depart from a protocol for a very long time, and that feeds into medical negligence. And I can't speak for American tort law, but the general principle is if you can justify departure from a protocol that's not negligent, it's okay. But increasingly, we will have these data-driven systems which will be extremely hard to challenge, and the consequences for individual lives will be profound, and we have no idea about the ethics of that.
I agree. This is at the crux of the personalized medicine.
Just as a point of protocol, because we have a lot of people that want to ask questions, I'm going to ask both questioners and speakers to try to be reasonably brief so that we don't just have one conversation on one question. Did the fellow in the front?
Yeah, I just wanted to I'll be very brief. I wanted to underline what Peter had said. I think the absolutely crucial issue here is trust. And you really do need to work hard to keep that. If you want a comparison, early in my career I worked in the nuclear industry, and that was an industry that lost trust to quite a large extent through its own fault. It was seen to be running a technology that was hostile and out of control, which wasn't true, but that was what the public perception became, and it never really properly recovered from that. So I think trust is really of key importance, and that's why I do think you need to be very, very careful about these applications in, for example, the criminal justice system. I'm not saying that I'm hostile to those, but there are the issues that we discussed before the break, and those are the kind of areas where we could be a serious danger of losing trust. Anyway, that's a view a bit from an outsider.
Just a brief response to that. I completely agree with you, and this is where I'm going to invoke the R word, because one of the common tropes in discussions about technological innovation is no regulation, it's going to stifle entrepreneurship. And the nuclear industry is a really nice example of the importance of regulation in order to ground the social license for particular technological activities. Because by finding ways to try and allow the benefits to be generated by minimizing the losses to an acceptable level, minimizing risks to a level that we as a society think are tolerable, then in fact regulation, as we saw in relation to the emergence of motor vehicles, is absolutely critical to securing the social license for an activity. So I would encourage you to think of regulation as not necessarily a dirty word, that actually it has an important social function if it's done well, and I think that it can be important.
I'm going to be very brief. I don't want to go. The nuclear industry actually was regulated. The problem was it didn't take care
Right.
with the public perception of what it was doing.
So on this, I want to thank you for the trust comment, and to synthesize a couple of things also that Joaquin said about the data being the sort of arbiter. We've had people throughout the meeting saying they're lawyers and social scientists and admitting that, and then talking about computer science. I'm going to do the opposite. I'll admit that I don't have any legal training, but the comments have led to a brainstorm, which I'm curious what my colleagues would say is when we in a legal setting, when a person testifies, there's this process of cross-examination, right? After they say what they think, and then they can be cross-examined. In some sense, one possible legal standard would be to have what the model says, and then allow data to be presented and saying, yes, but this model, on these two data points doesn't discriminate when we think it should, and that would put the burden on the algorithm developers to develop algorithms and train them with data that will withstand this form of cross-examination. In some sense, that's what trust is, and that's how we establish trust right now, is by character witnesses and cross-examination. We can apply that to algorithms as well from a data perspective, as Joaquin said.
Could one algorithm be called as a character witness for another algorithm?
So I want to pick up on a couple of points that have come up in the discussion. So I mentioned in my introduction, in the UK we did some work to engage with the public and actually have a dialogue with them and get a sense of their views. And one thing that was very clear, and it picks up on a point that Richard on the panel made, people's views about the use of algorithms and how content they are differ very substantially across contexts. In some contexts, and the medical was the most striking, they're actually very positive and about machine learning. People differed, but some people were quite relaxed about not knowing the kind of innards of the algorithm. If it had been shown to do well and do better than the doctors, they would be happy with that. In other contexts, they were more concerned. And I think one of the things that came out as part of the discussion is that I think at some level that does relate to trust. Because when they were asked what are the kinds of things that would reassure them or not, they talked about wanting to know who was using the algorithm. So I think broadly, even in a society that undermines skills, people still trust doctors. And so trust was, I think, part of the reason that they were happy in the medical context. And I think regulation is another part of that. Again, as Richard said, what would happen in a discussion of personalized medicine? Well, before things get put in people, as drugs, for example, there is a very heavy regulatory system, the FDA in this country and other mechanisms in the UK and Europe, which check that. And someone pointed out, we don't know for many drugs how they work or why they work, but they work and they're safe and we're happy with that. So again, it's a kind of trust issue without needing to know the reasons. Where people were more concerned were where it was companies who were kind of producing the algorithms, because there's a natural suspicion and skepticism about what their motives are compared to the interests of the individual. So just to reinforce the fact that it's good to have these discussions at a high level and a general level, but I think the issues are quite different in different contexts, and we probably need to think about that, and I think trust is a key part of that.
Hi. I just want to make 2 points. One is there is this sort of underlying theme that came up multiple times, that somehow the algorithms have to reach the level of the explanations that humans provide. I think, as Richard was saying earlier, humans should probably be seen in this point as like a low bar. We are extremely good at making up a system 2 explanation after a system 1 decision, and oftentimes we kind of confuse the fluency of explanation for adequacy. Kellyanne Conway is providing great number of explanations every day on the TV, and I don't know whether you consider it adequate or not. In this context, actually, machine learning systems can actually be, machine learning and algorithms, any algorithmic decision making can be a force for the good rather than the bad that we've been worried about. I mean, I love the fact that Martin Luther King basically said, let me put what is going on by people's decision making onto the TVs in front of them, and then let them decide whether they actually like what they're doing. And machine learning systems can do reverse engineering of the decisions that are being made by humans and saying, this is the better explanation that actually explains the data. Are we happy with it? And then that if we are happy with it, that's the society we deserve. If we are not happy with it, at least there's a good way in which actually we can change the system. So I think it's like, I kind of think of these explanations, that even simpler explanations, that interpretable explanations that any algorithm gives could be thought in terms of actually doing better than what we do, because we sometimes either knowingly or for ulterior motives come up with amazing explanations of things that we decided for very different reasons. That's part one. The second part is more of a technical one, which is just to keep in mind, and it came up multiple times in yesterday and today's discussions, that explanations are really, really with respect to a consumer's model. If I'm a physician and I came up with a diagnosis, I provide a different kind of explanation to other physicians versus a patient who has a much, much more simplified, incomplete, almost incomplete models of the world. And actually understanding what would that mean in terms of providing those kinds of explanations when you know that the consumer has probably incorrect, probably incomplete model, and you still want to provide explanations there. Humans do this all this time, but I think the good thing about algorithms is we can actually control whether or not they're actually, we can make them fully transparent, so you can actually make sure that they, that there is no ulterior motives on the algorithm side, whereas we always want to look good when we provide, after we make the decision, we give an explanation that makes us look good. So I think that part, that in fact the different kinds of explanations and the generation of those could be different, is something that we might want to keep in mind too.
Unfortunately, we're into an area of philosophy and epistemology and all kinds of things that most of us don't think about much, including me. But there have been explanations for everything throughout history. The devil made me do it.
Yeah.
Okay. So the question is, what it qualifies as an explanation? And there's no clear answer to that. That also is normative. The explanations are normative, and the evaluations of the explanations are normative. The nice thing about algorithms is the explanation is clear and not normative. Everything else that humans refer to, what a judge says, I've talked to a lot, they'll tell you why they made a decision, and you look at the data, and that's not how they made the decision.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay? That becomes a big disadvantage for the human judgment side of things that I don't think is given sufficient emphasis.
So if we are actually capturing, in addition to systems making the decisions, now we are also capturing a large amount of these decisions, and so an algorithm can provide an alternate explanation, not for a single judge, because working on retail saying, friend, you actually are biased in the following way because I can explain this single decision differently. Instead of that, you say the entire eastern seaboard is making decisions which are biased in this particular way, at least according to this post facto analysis of all these decisions. That's a very useful contribution to the society. Here we are reducing the inherent biases we tend to bring up, and then at least by putting it in front. And then just, I think the point about explanations not being well defined, I think it came up very beautifully when Yeung was saying, I hope I'm quoting you correctly, that you want somebody who came to a decision to sort of dignify you with an explanation. And oftentimes, that sort of reminds me of Jack Nicholson's thing that I was saying yesterday in A Few Good Men, that you can't handle truth, so I'm going to make up something that you would like to hear. And the machines actually can say what exactly are the pieces on which they came to the decision. And so if you have a whole bunch of most predictive characteristics of your decisions, it'll be useful for us to know, because then it will be much less of a...
Yeah, 2 points, and this gets back to a discussion.
So again, I'm going to try to prevent extended conversations between two people because we've got a bit of a backlog. So if you've got something very crisp to say, great, but I think we need to move on if we're going to get to the other people.
Explanation is about process, not about the actual accuracy of the information. The second thing is, yes, we can look at individuals because we have multiple instances in which a given individual makes a decision. Then we have data in which we can actually find out which judges are hanging judges, which are liberal judges, which police officers are acting inappropriately, and so on.
Yep. So I have, I guess, a question about the higher framework. So at the moment, the way we've talked about it, we are observing features and we are assigning labels. But in fact, we are taking decisions, and these decisions will then change the population of our features. And so if our goal is to minimize some objective, we should take into account how we're changing the distribution. So to be concrete, I think the criminal justice one is quite an interesting one. So you have this probability of recidivism, which is the probability of a new crime given a previous crime and your experience of the criminal justice system. And I'm wondering, whether it's worthwhile to look at how the population of future criminals changes depending on how you've decided to treat them presently. One thing, actually, Richard, that I thought was very interesting in your work is that the age for recidivism being most probable is teenagers. So one sort of thinks like, okay, so that's the age at which they're most sort of flexible and susceptible to being influenced, perhaps. Yeah.
I mean, I think in principle, the answer to your question is reinforcement learning.
Yep.
But that's a very technical answer to a very broad question. But that I think is probably the first thing that comes to mind to people from the ML community.
Yeah.
So we're using techniques that you invented to help solve this problem. So
I did not
gets
have this
into
question.
covariate shift and causal inference. That's exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Just a quick response to that. One of the real problems with law is that it's almost impossible to do rigorous empirical evaluation of the effectiveness of legal interventions because you can't do randomised control trials, that you just simply can't exclude all these other noise that affect what's going on in the real world. So there is actually very, very little empirical evidence of which legal interventions work because we simply can't do a rigorous clinical trial. So it's a nice idea, but unfortunately only in theory, because you wouldn't be able to make it work in practice to say the effect of our legal intervention in this case was these results, because there was all these other causal influences going on in a particular moment.
No, I wasn't sure. There was this hanging judge, non-hanging judge thing that you brought up yesterday, which perhaps addressed that point, but I don't want to.
Just a sentence. Yeah. Yes, we can, but it doesn't have to be, and it's not as powerful as randomized trials.
Okay. Good.
So let's say you're in the criminal justice system and you're assigned by Compass or Cynthia stuff or whatever. A nice interpretable model gives a number and the judge follows it. And then you hire a crack defense team of machine learning scientists to build the least interpretable but most accurate model and say that actually under this more accurate model you fall under the opposite class and should have had less time. Can I use that as a defense? Is effectively there a way to, in a sense, legally force less interpretable models to be used?
The answer is nobody knows. I'm surprised it hasn't been litigated because these risk assessment tools have been out there 80 or 90 years. If you want to get some attorneys and start that litigation, it'd be very useful because we don't have an answer. It hasn't been, at least in the United States, it hasn't been tested.
Ben, did you have a question? Because I've actually been keeping track of the order, and so you're up next if you have a question.
Yeah, so thank you very much. I really like the fact that the trust issue has been brought up. So thinking from more like a statistical machine learner, like how we could help to continue this dialogue, which we saw a kind of rigorous debate, which I enjoyed very much, is whether we can have some kind of protocol type of paper writing style, add more narratives to our usual technical writing so that people outside could see more clearly. We can also have the panel decide on certain protocol items. I understand there's a diversity. Can we cluster the different application area into a few identifiable clusters and have like guidelines for people like me when I write paper, and so I don't have to reinvent the view and use languages other people cannot understand. I also kind of check, say that my paper is actually, let's give a name, socially like responsible check, something like that, so that there's continue like flow of ideas and with relatively standardized language, so we can communicate across the boundaries of 2 disciplines or 3 or 5. Thanks. Yeah.
One of the proposals that's out there for this issue is having something like the FDA for algorithms, so that there's an intermediate body that we, for some reason or other, trust that makes these declarations about whether tools are appropriate. Then we don't have to litigate it tool by tool in courts.
So that's going to go, you think?
I have no idea, especially these days.
Who is organizing it?
No, this is just, there have been proposals like this in the legal literature. Some of our colleagues at Penn have been talking about this as another.
We translate that, implement it into the way in which we develop systems.
I'm very interested in building very specific use cases through a multi-stakeholder process with expert levels and a variety of very well-trained and aware stakeholders. So arrive at some generalizable best practices.
I think the answer depends upon where you think your expertise might be. My own personal view is that we need to be making algorithms that have these trade-offs explicitly introduced so that people can make informed decisions.
My answer is the same as Richard's.
Mine is too, but it would be nice if stakeholders would sort of pay attention to what we're doing.
And similarly, but I think it's a two-step thing. It's number one, making from a technical side, making algorithms that are configurable to different value assessments, and then number two, deciding as a society what values we want to have implemented and configured.
Yeah, but how we go about deciding that? That's what I'm asking. I understand the technical aspect, and I'm more worried about the regulatory aspect.
That's why I suggested a multi-stakeholder process, because I would really hate to see this litigated in a policy process at this point in time. So I would really prefer to see best practices come out from people who are at the expert level prior to any individuals or some very small group of individuals, perhaps with completely different stakes in the outcome, go to regulators and have an incredibly inconsistent and perhaps even non-fact-based view. So I think that the people in this room need to come together to have a multi-stakeholder discussion. It's not so much about the technology. It's about developing the best practices that are concise, Occam's razor, one page, perhaps two, and very much cover for example, the trust issue and other issues. I don't know what it looks like yet. I haven't seen it. It hasn't been created. It needs to be.
Or we could just do it by executive order.
Okay. Careful what you wish for. Let's have Nello and then lunch.
Thank you. I would like to just step out of it because I think we have explored this quite a lot. If I may have a slightly more general question about why we do all this. I am interested in why I do all this because I'm having a lot of fun with my own automatic large-scale analysis work and algorithms. But in general, why do we all seem to be accepting that more automation is coming and needed and welcome? And that is an ideological assumption that is pretty much generally accepted. So if you look online, there are 4 reasons that people always talk about automation of jobs, the 4D. Something you want to automate when it's dirty and disgusting and demeaning and dull. And that's why probably Zubin thought about automating statisticians first. But the other thing is that it is an ideology. It is not necessarily true that everything should be automated. And I think it follows for another ideology, which is everything should be optimized. The idea that everything should be optimized is quite easily questioned. We do optimize everything. For example, in logistics, we transfer containers and parcels and things run by algorithms. And we can squeeze the last 1-2% of performance by using linear programming or semi-definite comp programming and whatever we want to improve that. And it works. You save money globally. However, the experience on the individuals involved in logistics these days is horrible. They don't know what they're doing or why, simply because there is no longer a why. The system is so complex, they cannot comprehend it. You need a gigantic algorithm to make sense of their individual daily moves. You work and live below the API like an Uber driver. You do things you don't know why. If you are a TaskRabbit person, you don't know if you're really doing something worthwhile or if you're part of the randomized control. And we've been there before. Extreme push to automate, to maximally optimize and squeeze the most value out of everything is what gave us the assembly line and everything else, all the alienation that came with it. I wouldn't be so prepared to accept that everything that we can automate should be automated. And that is because there are other things that matter. And we accepted that as a society. There are many ways we can follow to save more money in this society, including, of course, killing the elderly and the disabled, but we don't do it. because we decided there are other things that go along with profit. I wouldn't be surprised if one day in the future, after many cultural advances, we are going to look back with surprise to this discussion. How could you possibly want to automate everything you can just because you can? Of course we can. In this room, we can fix all the little technical discussions you had about explanation. The ideological point is, do we want to maximally automate some aspects of life that might affect our everyday experience?
So I'll use executive authority here to make a comment, and then I think we should break for lunch because we're cutting pretty deeply into it. I think this is a good point that came up at a not dissimilar workshop that Pam and I were at Harvard back in November, and the moral philosopher Michael Sandel was present. And some of you may know a book he wrote called What Money Can't Buy, which is basically about the rise of markets and sort of market allocation of goods, and how much over the past 40 years, really since World War II, many things that used to be allocated by one social norm have basically become markets. So, you know, the kinds of examples he has in mind are, you know, things that used to be kind of a first come, first serve, like free Shakespeare tickets in Central Park. Now, you know, there's a market where you can pay people to stand in that line for you to get the tickets, right? And one of the very nice points he makes in this book is that there's a lot of things that even when you can efficiently or even more efficiently allocate them by markets, it actually changes the nature of the good itself in ways that, you know, we don't like as a society. And so I think it's worth people in this room thinking about, you know, what are cases in which even if the algorithm is going to make the exact same decisions that a human being or a human organization would make, or might even make decisions that we think are better in some sense, do we not want algorithms to make those decisions on moral or societal or other grounds? And, you know, one example that I think people in this room have mentioned is, you know, in warfare, you know, is it okay for a machine to kill a person, or should it always be the case that a person has to kill another person, even if the machine is somehow making better decisions about that than people would? And so I think I recommend this book to people, especially like because when I read it, it was after a very similar workshop, and I found myself thinking like, okay, what is the algorithmic analog of kind of market allocations, and what are the analogous kinds of things that we just don't want machines doing?
Can I just make a really quick point? I absolutely agree with what you said. And there's an excellent book by Nicholas Carr called The Glass Cage, which is about thinking about the social consequences of automation. And he leaves you with the question, what is it that gives our life meaning? What is it that makes life worthwhile? And automation might potentially affect that in ways that we can't anticipate. And so I absolutely agree with you that we really need to take care about how we make these decisions.
Okay.